Alright, what's up YouTube? Well, welcome back to the channel. My name is Crypt13, and in today's video, we are going to be going over the pros and cons of both Eula and Albedo, because definitely every character in this game has things that they both excel at and things that they don't. So if you've been on the fence on choosing between Eula and Albedo, hopefully this video will help you come to a conclusion on which decision to make. Really quickly before we get started, I am on Twitch and I am in Discord, so go ahead and check the description for those links. Alright, so let's go ahead and get started. First off, we're going to be taking a look at Eula, the good and the bad. First off, Eula's physical damage is absolutely insane. She is definitely hands down one of the best physical damage dealers in the game right now, because she can shred that physical resistance by herself, and she has a giant damaging nuke for her elemental burst. This thing can reach up to 1000% scaling, which in turn just gives you a buttload of damage on top of the already massive amount of physical damage bonus you build on her and the physical shred that you build on her team. You know, in the past, physical damage and elemental damage, like with Hu Tao, was a very touchy subject because physical damage could never really compete with elemental damage because it was a multiplicative elemental reaction, meaning that its damage is literally multiplied, whereas physical damage never really had that luxury. The only way physical damage could compete with elemental reactions was if it just had purely insane damage numbers, which with Eula, that's kind of what we got. Eula is definitely the character that utilizes physical damage and is enough to compete with a lot of the elemental reaction team comps that we have currently in the game, especially around freeze and melt. So even though she super excels at dealing physical damage, she definitely has some other cons that come along with these pros. That being that her elemental burst is very high cost with an 80 cost burst, 20 seconds cooldown, and it can very easily whiff against a lot of opponents. The AoE is decent, but it's not especially large, so when the enemies are really spread out, you're really going to notice how much you can whiff this move. Yeah, notice there, right? The hog was all the way over there, so we kind of whiffed against him, and now we're kind of out of luck here. A lot of the enemies are kind of spread out, so we have to decide who we want to go against. We got our burst up, but one of her most practical combos is to do E skill, Q, do a 4-hit normal combo here, do the hold, wait half a second, and then go into combos. And then see, we kind of killed everything, but we didn't have enough time to walk over to the next set of enemies, and then we just completely whipped our burst. So you'll notice that kind of happens a lot with Eula, unless you're very conscious about your positioning. So that's kind of something you have to be aware of and get good at with her. Because if you don't, you're gonna run into that situation a lot. And then you also have to manage your stacks correctly, right? So I already used 2, so I should be using my hold version here. So depending on the situation, you can't always do the same combo. So you really have to learn how to do Eula's combos depending on how many stacks you have. That's kind of the hard thing about Eula, is learning those. And of course, right, my Eula is not super invested into, so in terms of the damage output, that really shouldn't be what you're paying attention to. You should be paying attention to the gameplay style and the managing of the stacks and stuff like that. You can invest into your Eula to like max level and she'll do a lot more damage there. especially with all the super connect. But the core gameplay mechanic of managing all your stacks and doing the right combo at the right time might not be for everybody. And you saw that when I had Diona as my battery. You have to correctly battery your Eula to make sure that your Eula grabs the elemental particles. If you don't do that, then sometimes your elemental burst is not charged when you want it to be charged. So the high cost energy along with the easily whiffable elemental burst along with managing stacks is some of her cons. So think about that if you're deciding on wanting to pull for Eula. And that's kind of what my next section is the Grimheart stacks. It's pretty hard to manage sometimes. If you're always pressing your E skill and not using the hold E skill, then you're losing out on a lot of damage. If you can't keep track of when you have 2 stacks of Grimheart, then you're gonna lose out on a ton of damage because the hold version of her E skill has the same amount of scaling as her elemental burst, at least for the initial cast of it. We take a look at this. The hold damage 393. And the skill damage here is also 393, right? So that cryo damage is the same. And then you also should have the roiling rhyme damage, but this is 50% of the physical damage, so 50% of this is 300 scaling. So, right, the hold version is a decent amount of damage. So if you can't manage your stacks and use the hold version when you have it, then you lose out on a decent amount of damage. I have a video out there on my channel to help you decide what combo you have to do in order to get the max amount of stacks for Eula's elemental burst. So you should definitely give that video a watch if you are struggling with understanding how that stack system works. I'll have it somewhere in the description or maybe somewhere as a card on the screen somewhere, so go ahead and take a look at that. And another thing about Eula's burst is I'm pretty sure you kind of saw this. Like, you definitely know that Eula's burst can do a lot of damage, like 1,000,000+ damage. But you'll notice that those showcases are usually against single target enemies or against bosses because of the very reason that I just showed you. The AoE is not that great, and it's very hard to group up enemies with Eula, especially when you don't have a dedicated grouper and your team looks something like this. But when the enemies clump up and that elemental burst hits multiple enemies, that's when it's a feels good. That's really when it's a feels good. But Eula doesn't really benefit from having a dedicated grouper like, you know, Kazuha or Venti, because physical shred isn't affected by the 4-piece iridescent set. So they don't really play together that well in that sense. But it could be argued that, you know, just using it for the grouping ability is pretty good, because dealing massive elemental burst damage to multiple enemies is a very big DPS increase. So I'll just go ahead and recap the cons again. High elemental burst cost, a elemental burst that can easily whiff. You need to manage your Grimheart stacks appropriately. You also have to manage your stacks while in the elemental burst appropriately, depending on how many Grimheart stacks that you have upon casting your elemental burst. And positioning is really important with Eula. Very, very important. So if those things seem kind of hard, then perhaps maybe decide on pulling a different type of character. But then of course the pros is when all of those things come together and you are managing all of those things really well, her physical damage is just absolutely insane. Like, absolutely insane. So I tried to cover as many pros and cons for Eula as I could, but if I missed something, or if there's just something that you don't agree with in terms of the cons for Eula, then let me know down in the comments. And so now let's just go ahead and move on to what artifacts your Eula should run if you're going to pull for her. So the very obvious ones is a Pale Flame set and a Bloodstained Chivalry set, because they give you extra physical damage. Now, I would recommend running a 4-piece Pale Flame set if you have Eula's C2 or are planning to go for her C2, because the managing of the stacks is going to be much easier. When you're at C0, you don't have the full uptime for this 4-piece set bonus. Your attack is increased by 9% for 7 seconds. This effect stacks up to 2 times, and once the 2 stacks are reached, then the 2 set effect bonus is increased by 100%. So that's kind of wordy, but basically what it means is that this 4-piece set will give you 18% extra attack, and when you hit this 18% extra attack, your physical damage is also going to increase to 50% extra physical damage. So this 7-second duration here makes it so that if you have C0 Eula, her hold E skill is 10 seconds, So when you use that, you're going to lose your stacks on the 4-piece set bonus here. So that's why I don't recommend using 4-piece Pale Flame if you have Caesar or Eula. Instead, you should just go for a 2-piece Pale Flame and a 2-piece Bloodstained Chivalry, because this will give you a constant 50% physical damage without any conditionals. So it's pretty nice in that sense. The only thing you're going to be missing is that extra 18% attack bonus. So it's a little bit lacking in terms of damage there because you miss that extra 18% attack bonus, but the consistency here on the physical damage is what makes it very useful. That's my opinion though, because when you're doing her burst rotation, you're going to be using your E skill in very quick succession, so you're going to get the bonus from the 4-piece Pale Flame set, and for your elemental burst, you're going to have all of the buffs, so like no problem there. Before the elemental burst, you're not going to have the 4-piece set bonus from the Pale Flame set. It's hard to manage that and keep that at C0. So for Eula, you also want as much crit rate as possible. Right now, my Eula only has 64% crit rate, and honestly, I don't think that's enough. I think you really need to hit around 70, maybe even higher, because if you don't hit a crit on her elemental burst, that's a very big damage loss. It's just a very sad moment when your elemental burst hits and it just doesn't hit the crit. So, you know, when farming artifacts, that can get a bit tiresome, and it might take a little bit more effort to farm for your Eula than most other characters because she's so reliant on hitting that crit rate and hitting those crits on her elemental burst, right? For example, if you only are able to reach 50% crit rate, that's a literal coin flip on hitting a crit for her elemental burst. That's not good. That's very, very RNG based and, you know, massive damage loss. If you're flipping a coin every time you cast your burst just to hit that crit, oof. Big oof. Okay, now very quickly, weapons. Snow-Tomed, this guy right here is a very good free-to-play option. Since Eula is on the field so much, you know, this physical damage bonus is great, as well as this Icicle. This is also considered physical damage, so this Icicle gets boosted by the Pale Flame set, the Bloodstained Chivalry set, any Superconduct that you do, the Shred that Eula provides on her Hold E skill, all of that. That increases the damage of this Icicle as well. This Icicle is actually on par with the damage of your Roiling Rhyme here. It's a little bit weaker, but it's pretty dang strong. Don't sleep on that Icicle. This is a great weapon for Eula. But again, since we don't have any crit here, you really need to build a bunch of crit rate if you're gonna run this. You really need as much as you can. So, you know, when you build that much crit rate, it's kind of hard to also build crit damage in the process, so it's kind of a double-edged sword. Serpent Spine is really good here because we get a bunch of crit rate, so it allows you to build a little bit of extra crit damage in other places. But this, of course, is Battle Pass restricted, so, you know, if you're not buying the Battle Pass, then you're kind of just stuck with this. I've seen people suggest the Luxurious Sea Lord because of the Elemental Burst damage, which I do agree. Your elemental burst damage increases by a lot with this weapon, but when you're just dealing normal physical damage, which is a huge part of Eula's kit, it's a big hit to that. So think about that. If you don't want to lose the normal attack damage you're doing while not using your burst, then this is not the weapon that you should go for. If you just care about hitting big numbers on your elemental burst, then go ahead. Use this giant tuna fish claymore for Eula. Now let's quickly talk about her constellations, because I think her constellations are very good, very top-notch constellations, and I'm very happy that MiHoYo put some of her best constellations at the start. Not to say that her later constellations are bad, they're definitely really good, and they just give you extra damage, but I think that these first two are really good and really complete Eula as a character. Not very many characters have good constellations in the early levels, which, you know, makes it not attainable for a lot of people, so thankfully Eula is one of those characters. C1. So every time you use the hold version of her E skill, Eula's physical damage is going to increase by 30% for 6 seconds, which is very, very strong. Because if you do the proper rotation during her elemental burst, you're always going to have this extra physical damage bonus. Again, watch that video if you need to know how to do the proper rotation. But the proper rotation is the press version of her E skill. You use her Q, which gives you 2 stacks of Grimheart, and then you do a 4-hit normal attack combo, and then you use the hold version, and then you do another 4-hit normal combo. That's in general the proper rotation, and so if you do that, you will get this extra 30% physical damage bonus for her elemental burst, which is really the big and most important part. Right, and this one comes down to managing snacks again. If you want to get this bonus while just doing her normal attacks, you have to be aware of when you have 2 Grimheart Stacks and use it when you have it. C2. Let's talk about C2. C2 is super good. This is the one that allows you to run the 4-piece set bonus for the Pale Flame set, because it makes your E skill on your hold version now have a 4-second cooldown instead of a 10, I believe. Yes, right there. 4-second cooldown to 10. So the hold now becomes 4 seconds. A massive 6-second decrease. So that's just super good. Super good. And honestly, you know, I love Eula. I really like her a lot. The constellations that she has, they're so nice, and I really wish that I could pull for them. But I cannot give into the temptation and gambling and dump that much money into her and into this game. So, you know, here's my warning. Don't spend money that you guys don't have, because the monetary system in this game is very predatory. But Eula fans and mains who are all in just for her, these 2 constellations are really good. But if you're more of a collector type person and, you know, you want as many characters as you can get, constellations are very expensive on 5-star characters. So be very careful if you don't have extra disposable income. Now let's talk about some support characters for her, and let's talk about Superconduct, because Superconduct gives her a bunch of extra physical damage in the form of physical shred. So Fischl is great because Oz can very easily have 100% uptime if you have enough energy recharge. You just cycle your E skill and your elemental burst, and if you have C6 Fischl, the extra electro damage is just very easy to hit those superconducts. Tenacity of the Millith is really nice on her as a support artifact set as well, which I'm not running because I guess I totally forgot. I must have switched it with Albedo, because my Albedo, I think, is now running my Tenacity of the Millith set. But anyway, Tenacity of the Millith set is great for Fischl to support your Eula, because it gives an extra 20% attack bonus, which can be really good for her and increase the damage of her elemental burst by quite a bit, as long as Oz is on the field at the same time as your elemental burst. Oz does last 10 seconds, so it's possible to do so. Beto is a okay choice, but you know, it relies on her elemental burst. Her elemental burst is going to tick across 3 enemies as long as you have the right constellation. So this is very good, right? Because Eula is very much focused on spamming her normal attack. So every time you are hitting your normal attack, you're going to get a proc of Beto's elemental burst. The problem is being able to battery your Beto, because you're only going to be running 1 electro character, and she has a very high cost. She has a very high cost elemental burst, and her Tide Collar doesn't generate that many particles unless you get the maximum damage bonus. So, you know, you really have to hit those parries on point if you want to be able to battery your Beto solo. The next one is Raiden, and you know, I have my thoughts on Raiden. I think a lot of people have their opinions on Raiden. I think that she is okay. She's not amazing. Her E skill is really good for proccing Superconduct for Eula, because it doesn't matter where it is. You know, you're always just going to get that electro proc on top of Eula's attacks. So that's very useful for Eula and Superconduct. However, I feel like if you use Raiden on the team, it feels almost wasteful for your Raiden Shogun, because you're gonna have like no opportunity to cast your elemental burst, because Eula's playstyle has her on the field pretty much like 24/7, or basically as much as you want in order to deal her physical damage from her normal attacks. So you don't really get a chance to use Raiden's elemental burst. If you do use Raiden's elemental burst, then you take away from Eula's time on the field, and also the time to set up your Grimheart stacks to deal more physical damage and physical shred. So, you know, there's some trade-offs that you're making here. It really just feels wasteful to me, right? If you're using Eula, the reason why you use Eula is because you wanna keep her on the field and have her deal as much physical damage as possible. But, you know, the E skill is there. It's really good. It's honestly pretty good for Eula, so you could just exclusively use Raiden's E skill and ignore her elemental burst. But the good thing is that, you know, if you make mistakes on battering your Eula, then that gives you the opportunity to use Raiden's burst and cover your mistakes. So the point of using Raiden is to make up for the mistakes that you make, because if you play your Eula team perfectly and you correctly battery her, Eula should be on the field almost all of the time. Next up is Rosaria. Rosaria is a really good battery and crit rate support for our Eula. And I talked about how important crit rate is because, you know, you don't want to hit a non-crit for Eula's Elemental Burst. However, you know, after casting Rosaria's Elemental Burst, the crit rate buff lasts only 10 seconds, and the Lightfall Sword from Eula's Burst is only 7 seconds. This means you have to immediately switch into Eula and cast your Burst for the Lightfall Sword to have that crit rate buff, since Eula's Elemental Burst does not snapshot. Just in case if you don't know what snapshot mean, it just means that it will take the stats that you have at the moment of casting, and then it will deal its damage. So any buffs that you get afterwards don't count. But since Eula's Elemental Burst doesn't snapshot, your buffs need to carry out throughout the entire duration of her Elemental Burst, or else the final hit of her burst will not have the extra damage. So it's really hard to stack buffs on Eula's Elemental Burst. This means that, you know, if your team looks something like Eula, Diona, Rosaria, and Fischl, if your Diona has Noblesse Oblige, you might not get the effect from Noblesse Oblige because this is only 12 seconds. So it might just run out by the time your Lightfall Sword hits. So kind of unfortunate there. And another thing that Rosaria can provide for us is C6 Rosaria gives us even more physical shred, 20% for 10 seconds. So that's pretty nice, really good for our physical damage queen Eula here. And now let's talk about Diona, because I kind of just glossed over her, but she is very good for Eula because she generates so many particles, especially if you have a sacrificial bow. If you do the hold version of Diona's E-skill, it generates like 4 to 5 particles, which is absolutely insane. A shield is always nice for Eula, increasing her interruption resistance so that you don't get interrupted while trying to gain stacks. So honestly, I do think that Diona is one of her best cryo support partners. So here's my conclusion for Eula. If you want a main carry DPS character who is on the field a lot, then Eula is the character to go for. Just keep in mind some of the complexities that she has regarding her burst and, you know, trying to stack buffs on it. And also the frustration that comes from when you whiff her elemental burst, or if you hit a non-crit on her elemental burst. Other than that, you know, I freaking love Eula's design. I think she's amazing, and her attack animations are absolutely top-notch. She just dances on the opponents. I just have to say, don't slow down the footage. Don't pay attention to her second attack animations. Just don't do it. Just pretend that those missing frames don't exist. So that was Eula, but now let's go ahead and move on to Mr. Albedo. So Albedo, the main thing about Albedo is this here. His sub DPS or off-field damage potential is very, very good. It's very, very strong. He is definitely one of the best off-field damage dealers in the game and has very good AoE on that as well, because the Transient Blossoms deal AoE geo damage whenever they proc. Every 2 seconds, as long as you're dealing damage to an enemy. The move pretty much has a 100% uptime because it has a massive 30-second duration and only a 4-second cooldown. You pair Albedo up with Geo Resonance and your Transient Blossoms can start hitting for some really great damage numbers. He's also got a new artifact set coming along with his banner rerun, the 4-piece Husk of Opulent Dreams, or Hood for short, as I like to call it. I'm trying to make that a thing. Guys, can we try to make that a thing? The 4-piece hood set? But this is going to boost his damage output by quite a lot, because it increases his defense as well as it gives him extra geo damage bonus. And since the E-skill is scaled purely off of Albedo's defense stat, that new artifact set is just kind of tailor-made for our boy Albedo here. This is one of the main draws for Albedo, is if you need a sub DPS and off-field damage dealers. Do not sleep on off-field damage dealers because they are incredibly important for rounding out a team in Genshin Impact. If all the damage is only coming from your on-field character, then that character really needs to deal a lot of damage. I mean, a lot of damage. When you have off-field characters dealing damage on top of your main carry DPS, that's when your damage starts really increasing by a lot. So Albedo does just that. And I have to say again that he is definitely one of the best ones. Our other options for off-field DPS really are Xiangling's Elemental Burst here. Guoba is not too reliable. Beidou's Elemental Burst, Rosaria's Elemental Burst, Fischl's Oz, Xingqiu's Elemental Burst, and you know, out of the 4 stars, I'm just taking a look at the 4 stars. That's kind of where we're at, and you'll notice that most of those are based off of Elemental Bursts. I guess we could argue that, you know, Ganyu has some off-field damage as well with her burst, but as I'm looking through these characters, that's really all that I can see. Kazuha does some damage, off-field damage with his Elemental Burst. Yeah, that's really it. That's all that I can see out of the characters that I have. So I'm probably missing somebody. Just let me know down in the comments who else is a good off-field damage dealer, but Albedo is definitely one of the best. Definitely one of the best. But you know, let's go ahead and do a small little demonstration which will reveal some cons for him, because just like Eula, every character has pros, every character has cons. So you kind of notice, right, those two guys are kind of just barely out of range right now, but so you got to be conscious of your positioning and make sure that you stay within the AoE of Albedo. You see there, that guy is kind of out of range, so we kind of have to reposition, but not a huge deal in a lot of times as long as you are actively conscious about your positioning. Right, being conscious of keeping that thing inside of the AoE is very important. And then this gives us a chance to reset. Also, sometimes if you're not paying attention, you'll notice that you kind of get lifted up when you walk over the elevator. So sometimes that might catch you off guard if you're not paying attention. Keep that in mind. And then you'll notice here, right, against shields, Albedo just does not proc. So that's another thing you kind of have to think about, is Albedo will only proc when you deal damage. So, you know, against shields and stuff, Albedo kind of struggles. And honestly, that's kind of where mono Geo comps struggle in general, is against teams like that, against enemies like that. So that was just a small showcase for Albedo, his E skill. We didn't really see some of the cons that I'm about to talk about, but just know that these cons are still there. So let's go ahead and talk about what those cons are. So even though that the AoE is very large, it is stationary, and enemies can move out of range or stand just barely out of range, which means that you have to be very conscious of your positioning and make sure that you pull the enemies back into the AoE. You can also just move over there, switch back into Albedo, and reposition it, because that is such a low cooldown, but it kind of means that you break the flow of your on-field character if you want to do that. Thankfully for a Noelle, she doesn't lose her buffs upon switching, so that's really good. But you know, if you're planning to go for Itto, you will lose your buffs if you switch out. So you really have to be aware of your positioning with Itto, and if you're going to pair him up with Albedo. Also, you know, if you decide to use Albedo on a character team besides Noelle, and you use it with a character like Hu Tao, whose E skill will also go away upon switching, you can't really do that. You have to be very conscientious of your positioning. So these are characters like Hu Tao, Xiao, mostly just every other elemental infusion character besides Noelle. Noelle is like the only infusion type character that I can remember off the top of my head who keeps her elemental infusion like that, even after switching. That's one of the reasons why I love Noelle so much. It gives you a lot of freedom and flexibility on switching and reacting to the situation at hand. And here's another thing that I wanted to show. If you place this on top of another Geo construct, it will not spawn. So, you know, you also kind of have to be careful about how you spawn this, right? Especially if you're not doing the hold version. Things can get kind of iffy. So make sure you actually aim this properly so that you can get it out. So just like how you can't place your flower on top of already existing Geo constructs, if you place your flower into the hitbox or the collision box of a boss, it will also not spawn. So, you know, these are just some little micro things that you have to pay attention to. So let's go ahead and see if we can show this in action. So you'll notice there that it just doesn't spawn. It just doesn't spawn. So, you know, you got to be very careful, right? And if you place it that far away, then, you know, sometimes the AoE doesn't work. And you'll also notice there, it's not very durable. So, you know, it can break pretty easily. So when it breaks, you have to interrupt your flow and switch into Albedo to get another flower off. And then the last con that I have for you guys for Albedo is that he is a split scaling character. His E-skill and his elemental burst scale both off of his defense and his attack. More specifically, I think I mentioned this earlier, but E-skill is scaled purely off of defense, whereas your elemental burst is scaled off of your attack stat, until of course you reach C2. But until you get C2, your elemental burst is based off of your attack stat. So your elemental burst is not really that strong, especially since his E-skill is a lot more valuable. You want to build your Albedo for defense and get as much damage as you can off of your E-skill. Split scaling is just in general not very good because it splits the limited stat distribution that we have when building our characters with the limited amount of artifact pieces that we can use and the main stats that we can decide to run on them and substats. Until you hit C2, that's kind of the con there. Let's talk a little bit more about his E-skill, and I kind of already mentioned a lot of what this does, but there's a couple more things that you need to know about this. And the main thing is that Albedo's E-skill snapshots his stats at the moment of casting. This is kind of what we call a double-edged sword. So let's go ahead and demonstrate this. So let's go ahead and take out our Albedo stats. We're at 1,383 defense right now. And we don't have any Geo Resonance applied because we're not shielded, so we're not going to get that 15% extra Geo damage bonus. So let's see how much damage we're dealing with a typical E-skill with no buffs. 1,549 non-crit. And then 3,937 on crit. You know, and as I'm doing this test, I'm kind of taking a look at Albedo's energy generation, and it seems pretty good. Almost like every hit is giving us a particle. Almost. But yeah, you see that not always. You don't always get a particle every time. But you generally do. Almost every time. But anyway, I got distracted. So that was our damage. Let me reset this and increase our defense a little bit. So we're still doing 1549, right? Let me go ahead and eat some defense food. If I even have any left over. Let's see. We should have some Fisherman's Toast. Alright, so I popped the Fisherman's Toast. Our defense is now 1490, so we should deal more damage. But, as you can see, we're still dealing 1549 non-crits. And if I can actually hit a crit here, 3937 crit. That there is an example of snapshotting. Hopefully that makes sense. And this will also snapshot any damage bonuses as well. Our defense is boosted. Now let's see how much more damage we deal. 5,114 crit versus what? The 3,000 before? So that's a big boost. Let's do another demonstration on snapshotting the damage bonus from Geo Resonance. So we're going to use Zhongli. So let's figure out our damage here. 5,160. Crit. Or actually 560. 5651. Okay, 5651, okay? Now if we reset this. And oh, I'm not shielded. So let's shield. This should give us more damage. Hit a crit, Albedo. $66.86. There we go. There you go. So you see? So the damage bonus is snapshotted. We managed to show that damage bonus gets snapshotted as well, because we got a higher number there, because we casted our E-skill while we were shielded. That was a demonstration on how, you know, Albedo's E-skill snapshots. So, you know, this is something that you have to be very conscious of, because if you're not correctly snapshotting, then you are missing out on a lot of buffs that your Albedo can have while his E-skill is out. I also want to mention one more thing, is that Albedo's E-skill does not eat reactions. So let's go ahead and go to another dummy. We got to go back to our dummy. So a lot of people are afraid that, you know, since Albedo is constantly dealing geo damage, he's going to take away the elemental reactions that you are trying to do, like, you know, vape or melt. But here I will demonstrate that his E-skill does not take away a lot of the elemental aura for most characters. Right? We got a crystallized reaction right there, but the hydro is still very much applied. Right? The hydro just doesn't go away, even though we're creating crystallized reactions. So right, even if you run this in a Hu Tao team, your hydro aura is still going to be there. The crystallize, the E-skill procs doesn't take away a lot of hydro application or just elemental applications in general. So that's another good thing for Albedo's E-skill. And then lastly is don't sleep on the fact that Albedo gives 125 elemental mastery upon casting his elemental burst. 125 elemental mastery is a huge boost to elemental reaction teams. So yeah, just don't sleep on this. This is really good. This is super good. And if you want to just, you know, get an idea on how much extra damage that is, take a look at my my Tartaglia. He has 110 elemental mastery, and it's going to increase your vaporize and melt damage by 20%. That's pretty nice. So 125 is going to be a little bit more than this. That's of course if you're starting with 0 elemental mastery. If you have extra elemental mastery, then, you know, it's not a flat increase of 20%. It scales a little bit as you get higher and higher, but that's a general idea on how much 20% or 125 elemental mastery can give you. It's pretty good. Don't sleep on it. Alright, let's talk about Albedo artifacts, guys. So right now, without the new 4-piece hood set, his kind of best set right now is a support set, and that's going to be a 4-piece tenacity of the Millilith. Whenever his elemental skill hits an opponent, it will increase your party members' attack percent by 20% and also increase their shield strength by 30%. So, you know, this is definitely really good for a support-focused Albedo. And the good thing about this is that you don't have to invest heavily into Albedo to make use of this 4-piece set bonus. So you can have a low invested Albedo support your main carry pretty well if you run this artifact set. But now let's talk about the 4-piece hood set. A more invested Albedo is definitely going to do much more damage than supporting your main carry with an extra 20% attack, because with the new 4-piece hood set and Geo Resonance, you know, if you snapshot your E-skill properly, your E-skill is gonna hit borderline almost 20k with just a level 80 Albedo. That's really good. 20k per E-skill proc, and it's AoE, so if the enemies are all bunched up, ooh, that's a lot of damage. That is a lot of damage. So yeah, if you are going to be investing into your Albedo, then the 4-piece hood set is going to be much better than a support set to increase the damage of your main carry. Now let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the weapons, because when Albedo first came out, this 3-star weapon was one of the best weapons for him. So you'll notice that, you know, I still have it on my Albedo because it is definitely one of his best weapons right now. Even being a 3-star, the whole point of this weapon is this extra crit rate and this extra crit damage. So, you know, every time you hit a crit, it's pretty damn good. Even though base attack is pretty low, this crit really just carries this weapon for Albedo. The only thing you have to be worried about is that you have to stay above 90% HP. This means that, you know, with the new Rift Town enemies, you are no longer doggo proof. So with corrosion, you are definitely going to go down below 90% HP, and you are no longer going to have this extra crit rate. So that's very bad. You know, bringing this weapon into a Rift Town matchup is a very bad idea. Another good thing about being a 3-star is that it's pretty easy on your resources. So, you know, you don't have to spend as many of your resources, your weapon ascension materials, Mora, your enhancement ore to get this to max level. So, you know, this is also where the double-edged sword of his E-skill comes in, because it's going to snapshot his stats. So that includes the crit rate and the crit damage. So, you know, the first time around you place down your E-skill, and if you get corroded, you will still have your crit rate. But then when you reset it, then you're no longer going to have your crit rate. You're going to have to make sure you heal your Albedo before you place down another E-skill if you got corroded. You have to make sure he stays above 90% in order to snapshot your crit stats as well. It's very hard to test crit snapshot, but we already tested a defense snapshot, so, you know, that should be convincing enough. And then, of course, his new weapon. His new weapon coming in 2.3 is going to be Albedo's best in slot, hands down. And I will have another video coming out here looking at that very specifically, showing you the numbers and comparing it to the Harbinger of Dawn that we have here. And yeah, just trust me, I did the math. The new 4-star free-to-play weapon that's coming in the 2.3 event is going to be his absolute best weapon. It is, however, very niche. Pretty much Albedo is the only character that can use it, so if you don't have Albedo, you know, I guess there's really no reason for you to invest into that weapon. But if you do, make sure to give it to Albedo, because it's going to increase your E-skill damage by quite a bit. The next thing I want to touch up on, and I have been mentioning a lot, is Geo Resonance, because Geo Resonance is where Albedo really shines and increases the E-skill damage output by a lot. So if you're going to be running Albedo, running Geo Resonance is a really good idea, but of course you are not forced into running it. Just know that it's a very good idea to do so. And the most common Geo Resonance shell is Albedo and Zhongli. So if you have a Zhongli, picking up an Albedo is probably a good idea. They are a very strong pairing to just kind of throw onto any team that is a strong shell. You know, for example, Hu Tao and Xing Chu, and then your other two characters would be Albedo and Zhongli. That's a very easy example of how to just slot this pair of characters into any team comp that you want. Now, when Goro drops, Albedo and Goro could be a new, very good Geo Resonance shell. The only thing is that Geo Resonance shell is going to rely heavily on Crystallize, and historically, Crystallize is not very reliable. But, you know, I would like to try it myself and see if the Crystallize is actually a little bit more viable than we originally thought, because Goro is just going to increase your Albedo's damage output by even more. So that off-field damage and against multiple groups of enemies, your damage is really just going to skyrocket. And of course, remember Snapshot. You have to make sure that you snapshot the elemental resonance here, the damage bonus, so don't forget that. So yeah, Geo Resonance is very easily slottable into very many other kinds of teams. Now let's go over Albedo's Constellations, because let's talk about his first two ones. I don't really like talking about, you know, past C2, maybe C3, but C3 is usually just a skill increase. But because, you know, the first two Constellations is a little bit more attainable for the average person. So the C1 and C2, they're pretty good. C1 just gives him extra energy. So, you know, this is kind of okay. It's nothing too huge, because his elemental burst is already just a 40 cost burst, so it's pretty low. You know, you don't really have to worry too much about it. But this extra constellation definitely just ensures that you are able to cast this basically off of cooldown or whenever you need to. It's also, you know, better depending on the team comp that you're running. If you're running a team comp that is running elemental reactions for the extra 125 elemental mastery, it's pretty good. If it's just C1, I wouldn't rely on the damage from your elemental burst because it's split between attack, right? So since you're dumping and focusing mostly on defense, the damage from this is not as amazing as it is from your E skill. So it's not until you hit your C2 where your elemental burst gets a big buff. And this one is pretty dang good because now your elemental burst scales off of defense. We can get up to 120% extra damage on it. Let me clarify that. So how this works is that Albedo gets this stack system called Fatal Reckoning, and these stacks last for 30 seconds. You can have a maximum of 4 stacks, and each stack increases the damage of your elemental burst by 30% of Albedo's defense. So in terms of calculation and math, this is going to work very similarly to Zhongli's passive skills. So if I go ahead and pull up Zhongli is based off of HP, so it's obviously going to be less percentages here because HP is a much larger number, but it's very similar in how that damage calculation is done, in that it is flat damage increase. C2 is 120% of Albedo's defense, flat damage added to your elemental burst. So 120 defense. Let's go ahead and take a look at my Albedo. He doesn't really have that high defense. In fact, did I remove artifacts from him? I don't think I'm running like a proper one. Yeah, look, I'm running attack percent and not defense there, so I'm not even running the proper one. So right, your Albedo's defense, if properly built, you know, you can hit like 2k here, and 120% of that is what, like 2.2k, 2.4k. So that flat damage is just added on top of your elemental burst damage, which is a lot because that flat damage is also affected by damage bonuses, the enemy's resistance, and crit. So it's pretty dang strong. However, you know, this doesn't mean that you should build Albedo purely in defense. Like, you should not run defense on your sands, your goblet, and your headpiece. You shouldn't do that. This is a bad example. Don't look at this. This is not how you want to build your Albedo. You want to still do defense here on your sands, geo damage bonus on your goblet, and some kind of crit on your headpiece to maximize your damage output. So, you know, C2 is a very nice boost on your elemental burst indeed. But, you know, of course, you know, it does rely on getting 4 procs first in order to maximize that damage. But pretty dang good. Pretty dang good. You know, my conclusion for Albedo, if you're looking for a sub DPS character, an off-field damage character that definitely does it the best, then Albedo is the character for you. Alright, if you don't need any more main DPS characters, if you need more off-field damage, Albedo is pretty dang good, and against really clumped up enemies, groups of enemies, that E skill damage is really good. It's really nice. It's really dang nice. You know, those are the pros and cons for Albedo. And in this video, I really tried to cover as much as I could for these 2 characters, but I know I probably definitely missed something. So leave a comment down below if you have any other tips for these characters so that we can all learn together and get that knowledge. And again, guys, I'm on Twitch, and also you should join the Discord just to, you know, have fun and hang out. And if you made it this far into the video, thank you so much. Consider leaving a like, and maybe even consider subscribing to the channel. Until next time, guys, I hope this video helped you out in deciding who to pull for, but I will see you guys later.